And is this like the theater room?
Yeah, I'm in the makeup room of the theater.
I
Yeah.
love that. That's great. Well, thanks for taking the time and talking to me.
Oh, please, thank you, especially when you're a little under the weather, I
Yeah,
hear.
well, I'm better. I'm on the road to recovery.
Excellent. So, you've described the film as a reimagination of this 1974 conversation between writer Linda Rosencrantz and photographer Peter Hujar, who she asked to recount a single random day in his life. And you're able to liberate the film from the literal in some respects while embracing the specificity of the original conversation. I'm curious, how long was the original conversation between Hujar
Mm.
and Rosencrantz?
Well, there's no audio tape, so I can't tell you exactly how long. I think it was a single session, and based on um, based on the length of pages, I would guess around an hour and a half or 2 hours.
Mhm.
That would be my guess.
Uh-huh.
And probably took place at at a table without much movement.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so let's get into how you turn that into drama. Uh, so it's formally fascinating, probably your most formally fascinating film.
Thank you.
The conversation itself and the day being recalled both trace morning to night, as you framed
Mhm,
it,
mhm,
nearly wake to sleep, right? So
mhm, mhm.
it's kind of time is so precious, so there's a kind of light absurdity to the notion of taking an entire day to relive an entire day.
Right,
That that's kind of
right.
interesting within that framework, and not a particularly profound day either. But once your mind goes there, it really underlines, I think, what drew you to the material, the intimacy of this conversation and these two
Yeah,
people's connection. It's not really a relived day; it's a new day between these two, and they're actually honoring each other's art. They're having
right.
this fresh conversation. He's kind of doing it for the sake of art and for his friend's art, and the interest and
Yeah.
support is presumably mutual between the two. So, how much of all that, if any, was on your mind in the writing and prepping phase versus what the film tells you that it is in the editing room, or living with it over time, or seeing it with an audience, or discussing it in interviews?
I love how you talk about the film. I'm looking forward to reading your whatever you write. So you got to make sure I get a copy of it. Um, because in a way you make literal, though not too literal, kind of an essence of the film that in some ways for me I work in a more instinctual way, in the sense that I read the material while I was working with Ben. I was enjoying working with Ben, and I wanted to continue working with Ben. Um, and I wanted to make art with him. And I felt like reading this, it seemed like we could do that together. I was particularly moved and satisfied by the last scene in the film, or the last scene in the book, which is Peter in the middle of the night listening to the prostitutes on the corner below his window on Second Avenue and 12th Street. And I found that image so vibrant and melancholy. And also to be with someone when they are alone is one of the great qualities of cinema, right?
Yeah.
Like it's an oxymoron. And somehow cinema is one of the greatest places where you can be in the presence of someone who is alone. And I think that was a feeling that I had that to me made me think this could be a movie.
Mm.
Um, how it would become a movie was something I didn't really think about very much until about 6 weeks before I started shooting, when I realized I had no idea. Because I imagined that I was going to block the material in a kind of real time um, manner, and that I would stage the conversation. And I suddenly realized when I had two stand-in actors on location and we started to work like a rehearsal, the two of them and myself trying to figure out that there was no justification for any movement. So I thought this is perhaps a terrible idea I've had. I was saved, I might say, by two things. One was watching a bunch of very personal, handmade portrait films made in the 60s and 70s, including Shirley Clarke's Portrait of Jason, Jim McBride's My Girlfriend's Wedding, and Andy Warhol's Poor Little Rich Girl, which is Warhol spending some time with Edie Sedgwick at the Chelsea Hotel. And I realized that my friend would be the cut. And and it might seem obvious that I could break space and time with a cut, but it was not obvious to me until I saw these films that had done so because um, inevitably, because in one moment Jim McBride with his girlfriend on a couch, and the next moment she's on a terrace. Well, we don't know how she got there, but they're still talking. And somehow seeing those ellipses gave me a kind of direction. The other thing that was very helpful was that I shot images of these two stand-in actors at different times of day in the location. And I began to see when I looked at that sequence of photographs that it was a sequence that could be a sequence of scenes. So, and the really hard thing was to say that the audience will accept the cut as the way they got from one to the other. But they do, obviously.
Yeah. It's interesting because when you start to talk about this, I also think about what obviously, and you've talked about it too, what the actor brings, and oftentimes that's through a rehearsal process, which you eschew, that you would discover like, oh, the motivation to, how can we energize this with some blocking or whatever. But I guess you were kind of working that out uh, before the actors came in, and then also to some extent on the fly with them on the day, or can you talk a little more about that?
Sure. I mean, they never would have been able to come up with 65 motivations for moving when two people are talking across the table. Like, I came up with four or five that are in the movie. So, for example, a tea kettle that's boiling, or a jackhammer that's making too much noise outside a window, or you need an extra, you've run out of cigarettes, so you have to go to the door to get more cigarettes in your coat pocket. Like, I could come up with a few, um, but basically, I needed another way to get through time than that. And I will say, I don't rehearse, but I do block. So, for example, there is one very long sequence that is very choreographed, which includes like picking up the tape recorder and moving it to the table, and going to get this cigarette, and getting something from the kitchen and bringing it to the table. Now that is blocking, and I worked for several hours on location with the actors to make that happen. We had to work that out in a certain way.
Mm,
But I like to do a lot of that work on my own or with my cinematographer as I imagine a sequence of shots that can construct a film.
mm. I also want to ask about the moments where the visible crew show up, and mostly towards the beginning, at the very beginning, and then towards the end. Um, were those moments that you decided upon in the editing room, or were they always in your script?
Well, I guess I was I felt to some extent that as I was deconstructing this text, that the process of doing so was part of what kept my interest. Like, how am I breaking this down? And so I did shoot a lot more process than you see in the film. Um, but ultimately, I decided that for the most part, the text was the story. On the other hand, I didn't want to lose the kind of unreal element that was always interesting to me. And I would say, particularly because I was working with, well, one reason, I wouldn't say particularly, but one reason was I was working with two actors who were constructing characters in different accents than their own. So having two British actors play two Americans meant I was already entering the realm of the theatrical, and I wanted
Mm,
to embrace that.
mhm. Um, from one angle, it's an experimental take on the biopic, not unlike Rosencrantz herself noodling on an experimental take on biography to look at one day as perhaps representative of a life. Um, is to what extent did you see the film as a sideways biography of Hujar?
Hmm. Um, that's interesting. I did not think of it as a biography. I did think of it as biographical because it's like, I mean, it's funny. I'm reading a writer named Thomas Mallon. I'm reading his diaries right now, and I read a lot of memoir. I like when people pay close attention to 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 the details of their life. It's also, I love, like, Proust is one of the greatest reading experiences of my life, and I think it's about attentiveness. I'm also interested in psychoanalysis as an ongoing process. So for me, it was the kind of richness of this life. What's interesting to me is Peter is revealing uh, very much of kind of inner conversations that he's having, but he does not analyze himself, right? He
Yeah, he
doesn't
tells on himself.
he tells on himself, and he's transparent, which is quite beautiful. But he isn't sort of doing he's not trying to then come up with the subtext of his own being. And I like that too, because in a way it means the audience can do that, or Linda is maybe doing that in a certain way. Linda is certainly an active listener in the film. And I think that's part of the nature of the friendship you see between the two, is that friends care about the details of their friends' lives.
Mhm. So obviously you've shaped it, but it's more or less a found script, which presents a kind of acting opportunity that, to me, reminded me of Anna Devere Smith's work or the Tectonic Theater Project, doing
Yeah.
the Laramie Project.
Yeah.
There's a difference, of course, because they conducted these interviews and then they created the art.
Yeah.
But you all did sort of due diligence with a couple of audio recordings that exist of Hujar and, of course, the availability of the very alive and well Linda Rosencrantz.
Yes.
Uh, so those things often, actors talk about kind of absorbing them by osmosis and then kind of making them subconscious or unconscious when they're acting. The moment to moment performance is not going to be thinking of those things, obviously.
Yeah.
But can you talk a little bit about how you and your actors, how how that research helped or didn't help at times?
I think it helped because it was not obsessive. I ended up doing a kind of deep dive, if you can call Google and Wikipedia deep, to try to illustrate and to illuminate for Ben the 50 plus characters that he describes in the course of the film. And so I gave him just little Reader's Digest versions of who everyone was and some links to who people were. So, but I have to say the fact that he then took all of that and made them all human somehow in his performance, like everyone seems to be alive that he's describing and to really have shape. That is the miracle of acting.
Yeah,
That's like something that Shakespeare would describe in terms of like what the what the magician can do on stage, really. Because I couldn't even remember all. I mean, those people. So I would say that Ben had all that research, and I think he enjoyed it. And I think he listened to one tape specifically that was a conversation between Peter and David Wojnarowicz, which I think gave him certain direction. But he is certainly not doing an imitation of Peter's voice, which is quite different than his own. Um, and I think there was always an understanding, and that is partially why, from the first shot, I include the clapper, that we were making something new and contemporary, and that we had no rules.
hmm. Obviously, you're involved in a fruitful collaboration with Ben Wishaw on passages in this, and I've heard you're looking to other projects you might work with him on in the future. And of course, you're working with Rebecca Hall for the first time here. Can you talk a little bit about uh, their personalities and what makes them good collaborators for you, and also, I guess, professionally, what makes them right to work with you?
Well, professionally, they both have a touch of genius, to be honest, like just a little bit. It's, I think they have an ability I mean, maybe the word would be brilliance more than genius somehow.
Mm,
They have a brilliant nature as performers. I really think brilliant meaning bright and 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 unique somehow and thoughtful and profound.
mm,
I would say both of them have that ability. I think we've discovered that we enjoy each other and we all love art. The three of us. We love art and we love art making and we love artists. And I think we love that more than success.
mm, mhm. Um, you've talked about taking that set and spending a lot of time in there with your cinematographer, the stand-ins you talked about, and realizing, oh, this one space can be 33 locations, including going up on the roof and so on.
Yep.
Um, and each setting kind of subtly becomes part of the jazz of the conversation. So I'm curious if you recall any specific discoveries by yourself or the actors in that regard that oh, by having this scene take place here or in this light, it's there's something happening in this moment.
Well, to me, the whole film is a kind of John Cagean experiment because except for the last scene where I specifically wanted him to be by the window at dusk, um, it was actually dusk. It plays as dawn. Um, uh, besides that, it was completely random what portion of the text they would be talking about within a certain scene. I would move to a certain scene because the scene before could only withstand a certain number of pages, and then I needed to cut. And I had a sequence of things that was uh, through time and through locations, but it never particularly matched the text in a conscious way, but it affected the text in a very, very deep way. So, for example, they happen to be talking about Betty Davis and Joan Crawford while they are in bed at night with one single lamp illuminating them. And that means that bit of conversation has a kind of intimacy that it would be very different if they were on the terrace at that point with the noonday sun and the sounds of the city, amplified. That conversation would feel totally different. So that to me is kind of it was kind of a random act of creative license in a certain way.
Mm. Yeah, so they end up being those kind of lucky accidents that
Well,
actors talk
everything is it's everything is a lucky accident.
about.
Um, like the fact that they're talking about um, the artist who steps off the cliff in Brazil as they're sitting at a kitchen table with just a candle keep was also an act. Like, I don't know, everything was an accident, but that was sort of planned. It was planned that there would be something random. And I would say what was great about Ben and Rebecca is they went with whatever I told them. I'm like, now you're going to be on the bed. Now you're going to be outside. Now, and they were just like, okay, let's do it.
Um, this also reminds me. There's a comment Rosencrantz has in the script that it's just a passing comment in this conversation, but it so spoke to me about the film itself that it seemed like it almost had to be scripted by you. Where she says, "See what happens when you step back, all hangs together."
Yeah.
It almost seems like a time warped direction from the young Rosencrantz to you. I don't know if there's anything to that
Oh,
or
that's
not.
yeah. I love that. I love it because I'm working on a new film now, and I'm stepping. Oh, hold on one second. I have some soup boiling. That's what happens when you do interviews when you're at home. You make soup while you're doing
No, it's great. It's blocking.
it. Exactly. There was a
Yeah.
justification. That's right.
um, so uh, I'd like to hear you talk a little bit about the musical choices. Mozart's Requiem and Hold Me Tight by Tennessee Jim. You couldn't have two more different needle drops than those, but
I
how'd you
love that
come to them?
everyone talks about Tennessee Jim now as if they've heard of him before.
Yeah, no.
We couldn't find Tennessee. Nobody could find Tennessee Jim. Like, but I think I like that it's Mozart and Tennessee Jim. Those are the two cues together. And I think the Mozart was the idea of my wonderful editor, Afonso Gonzalez. He and I have been working together since the Delta, so that's 1995. So a long time, 30 years. And in a way, what I love about it is that it elevates the ordinary to something more monumental, and it's almost campy, I would say. It veers towards camp, but I think that's okay. Like that's the kind of Fassbender element, which is camp, which is like there's something about taking one's day seriously, which is over the top and also important.
Mm,
And the dance sequence, which was not in the audio and didn't exist, was for me a way to give a kind of interlude of intimacy that wasn't verbal
mm,
for the
mm,
two actors. And again, I actually was thinking of Fassbender's use of kind of old uh, country pop tunes that he does often in his films. And then there's a way in which they're nostalgic and yet they're also tough. They're kind of the two at the same time.
uh-huh. It's almost time for us to wrap, but I wanted to ask you in one of the talks or interviews that I watched in preparation for this, you mentioned that you and Linda call each other Sid and Imogene in
Yeah.
reference to your show of shows, Sid Caesar, Imogene. Uh,
Yeah.
uh, she bears somewhat of a resemblance, maybe, but how did those names get stuck to you?
Well, I sent her a picture, a photograph that I took of the two of us, I guess it was at some point, maybe a year ago. And she said, "How did I turn into Imogene Coco?" That's how it happened. And I said, "Well, if you're Imogene, I'm Sid." And I will say, I think we connect because our great grandparents were in the shtetls together somewhere back in the day. I think there is really, she reminds me of she is family in a certain way. And I think there was an instant familiarity, partially because of our Jewish ethnic history, but also I think that for me as a gay man and her as a heterosexual woman who has had lots of very deep relationships, friendships with gay men, I think that there is I feel part of that lineage.
Hmm. Well, it's been a pleasure to talk with you as always.
Great
Best of
talking
luck
to
with
you,
the film.
Peter.
Thanks a
Thanks a
lot.
lot. Appreciate